This is what it looks like when you become the narcissist karma. What if the way we've been taught to understand narcissists and karma is entirely backward? So many believe that karma arrives late, creeping in when the narcissist begins to age, when their charm fades, when they find themselves alone in a quiet room echoing with the silence of abandonment. People imagine karma as an external force that punishes them after the damage has been done. An empty house, a hollow legacy, a face in the mirror that no longer seduces. And while those outcomes may eventually manifest, they are not the beginning of karma. Because karma didn't wait for the end. Karma arrived the moment you did. You were never just another person who wandered into their life. You were the event. You were the reckoning wrapped in grace. You entered with a kind of love they didn't understand. Love without an agenda, without performance, without demand. You offered something sacred, something they secretly longed for yet feared more than anything. A love rooted in soul, in presence, in unconditional truth. And they rejected it. They rejected you. But that rejection wasn't just a mistake. It was a spiritual catastrophe. Because you weren't there by accident. You were the one sent to them as both offering and mirror. You were the divine invitation to redemption. And by turning you away, they didn't just lose a relationship. They closed the only door that could have led them back to themselves. Let's start with this. You reflected a truth they were desperate to hide. You weren't merely a new supply, another ego boost to manipulate. You were the mirror they couldn't dim. Through your authenticity, you showed them what they had become. Not the facade, not the polished persona they curated for admiration, but the raw emptiness underneath. The emotional rut, the spiritual poverty, the hollow core they spent a lifetime disguising. Your light illuminated the darkness they couldn't escape from, not with lies, not with charm, not even with control. And that light burned them. You were not just someone who loved them. You loved the parts of them they were taught to hate. You touched the wounded child hiding beneath the armor. And that kind of love, pure, unfiltered, fearless, is excruciating for someone who has built their entire existence on avoidance. Each time you reached for them with tenderness, each time you showed up without expectation, it forced them to face the very self they had buried under manipulation, grandiosity, and rage. And they couldn't handle it, not because you were wrong, but because you were too right. So what did they do? In their panic, in their desperation to escape the mirror, they shattered it. They shattered you. And that moment, that act of betrayal, wasn't just about protecting their ego. It was spiritual suicide. Because in breaking the mirror, they destroyed the only path they had to true transformation. No therapist, no new lover, no temporary high will replace what they threw away when they lost you. And now, wherever they go, they are haunted, not by you, but by the fragments of themselves you once held up for them to see. Fragments they now stumble over again and again, believing they were buried for good. And here's the second truth they cannot bear. Your growth is their failure in motion. While they remain spiritually stuck, cycling through illusions and blame, you rise. Your healing, your evolution, your return to yourself. It is not just your victory, it is their silent defeat. Because every soul is sent here with assignments. Some come to learn how to surrender. Some come to break ancestral cycles. Some, like you, are sent to illuminate others. And they were given the rarest opportunity to be loved in a way that could have rewired everything. But they didn't take it. So now, they scroll through your life from afar. They hear about your peace. They sense your glow. But they can't touch it anymore. And that knowing that the one person who could have saved them is now out of reach is their karma. Because you weren't just a relationship. You were the divine turning point. And they missed it. There are souls born into this life to become the bridge. Across generations, across lifetimes, across legacies soaked in betrayal, greed, or violence. These are the ones chosen to break the spell, to interrupt ancestral cycles, and to create something whole from centuries of damage. That was your path. And then there are others, souls like the narcissist, who arrived not to dominate or devour, but with their own sacred mission, to dissolve their obsession with superiority, to shed the weight of their manufactured persona, to remember their true self beneath the need for control, entitlement, and illusion. Their test wasn't abstract. It wasn't philosophical. Their test was you. You arrived carrying truth in your voice, compassion in your hands, and light in your eyes. You offered not just love, but the kind of love that awakens something buried. You were their invitation to heal. But they refused, not because they couldn't see the opportunity, but because they didn't want to take it. And as you expanded, spiritually, emotionally, even financially, your evolution became a mirror too painful for them to bear. You became the undeniable proof that healing is possible. That wholeness isn't a performance, it's a path. And every time your name is spoken, your work seen, your peace felt from afar, they are reminded of what they surrendered, not by accident, but by choice. They didn't just lose a relationship, they lost a chance to become. Because while you grew roots and wings, they remained trapped in the same performance, stuck in a theater of illusion, acting out the same script of power and emptiness. They stayed loyal to a lie while you stepped into truth. And that, in itself, is the karma. Not because you wished them pain, but because they had the same opportunity to rise, and they let it rot in their hands. Then came your love, unfiltered, unconditional, unearned. And that, they could not hold. You arrived not as a punishment, but as a quiet revolution. A soul who didn't demand performance, who didn't require manipulation, who wasn't attracted to image, but to essence. You entered their life as divine intervention in disguise. You offered the kind of love that doesn't take, that doesn't scream, that doesn't manipulate. It simply stays, gently, until it can't anymore. But for someone whose entire world is constructed around smoke and mirrors, your presence was like a spotlight in a darkened room. You illuminated what they've tried for decades to keep hidden. The shame behind the arrogance, the abandonment behind the aggression, the deep unworthiness behind the charm. And no matter how hard they tried to distort it, you didn't flinch. You didn't collapse. You didn't fall for the game. You loved them not for their mask, but for the forgotten child buried beneath it, the version of them they swore to never feel again. You were not just loving them, you were embodying grace. You became the vessel through which the universe said, "Here is what healing love feels like." And that terrified them, because that kind of love doesn't inflate the ego, it feeds the soul. And the soul is the one thing they've been at war with their entire life. They didn't just reject you, they rejected the divine message you carried. They pushed away the sacred because it didn't make them feel powerful. It made them feel seen. And being seen was something they never allowed themselves to experience. Not without a script, not without control. This is why, when they discarded you, it wasn't just personal, it was spiritual betrayal. They didn't walk away from a relationship. They walked away from the very thing their soul cried out for and couldn't receive. And yet, your absence pierced them in ways your presence never could. They were convinced that losing you would be a relief. That once your questions stopped, your standards were gone. Your voice went quiet. They could finally exhale. But they failed to realize that you were the very breath keeping them alive. You were the stillness in their storm, the only non-transactional space in a life built entirely on conditions. And now that you're gone, there's a gaping wound where real love once lived. They try to fill it, desperately, obsessively, with replicas of what they think you were. New supplies, quick hits of attention, empty connections, but none of it sticks. Because sacredness cannot be replaced by convenience. You can't manufacture what only the soul can recognize. They may parade around with new faces. They may look happy in curated snapshots. But behind all that noise is a funeral that no one sees. A quiet, slow death not of the body, but of the spirit. Because what they lost when you left was not just companionship. It was meaning. It was reflection. It was the only living proof they had that they were once seen, once held, once loved without a price tag. And what they feared losing all along wasn't attention. It was connection. And now, they are left with performance, applause, distractions, but no peace. Because peace was you. You can't recreate something sacred with manipulation or tactics. What you brought into their life wasn't just rare. It was once in a lifetime. And when someone loses that kind of presence, they don't just lose a person, they lose a part of themselves. But instead of admitting the loss, they pretend. They perform. They act like it never mattered. But the truth is, since the moment you walked away, it's felt like a funeral they never got to grieve. Not because someone physically died, but because something deep inside them did. The connection, the clarity, the truth you reflected back at them, that's what's gone. And they know they'll never get it back. You were the last one who saw them clearly, the wounds, their fear, the humanity underneath all that pretending, and still chose to stay. Until you couldn't anymore. Reason number 5. You triggered their deepest fear. And no, it's not being caught. It's being seen. Narcissists move through the world like they're invincible. They try to convince everyone that they're untouchable, always in control, always one step ahead. But underneath all of that, their entire sense of power depends on people not looking too closely. They thrive on confusion, intimidation, and illusion. And then you showed up and didn't flinch. You saw through the image, through the ego. You didn't get pulled into the story they were selling. You didn't react the way they expected. You didn't break down, beg, or cling. You stayed grounded. You stayed clay. And you stayed real. That rattled them more than anything else ever has. Because when someone who's built their entire identity on masks meets someone who doesn't need one to feel whole, it shakes them to the core. You carried something they couldn't fake, couldn't steal, couldn't destroy: integrity. And every single moment you spent in their presence reminded them of everything they pretended to be, but never were. It wasn't being exposed to the world that scared them. It was being exposed to you. Because you weren't just looking at them. You were reflecting them. Like a mirror they couldn't crack or distort, you held up the truth. And that truth made their entire fantasy impossible to maintain. That's why they needed to tear you down. Not because you were weak, but because you saw too much and stayed too steady. And that made you dangerous to their illusion. So no, you weren't just a chapter in their story. You were the pivotal moment, the test, the truth, the one person who came into their life not to worship them, not to fight them, but to offer something real, something healing, something that scared them more than any consequence ever could. And the harshest karma isn't what might happen to them in the future. It's what they already lost when they lost you. You didn't leave out of hate. You left because your soul knew it couldn't keep shrinking in a place that refused to honor it. And that quiet goodbye, that was the loudest truth of all. Because when light leaves a space, all that's left is darkness. And now, they sit in that space, haunted not just by your absence, but by who they were when they had you. You didn't just survive them. You evolved beyond them. And that is the kind of reckoning no soul can ever really shake off. That's where we'll end today. I hope this message found its way into a part of you that needed it. As always, thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.